Now I have the center quilting done. All the squares are filled in. There's some lint. All the squares are filled, straight lines through, and then little arching lines around. Feathered stars in here. The next step will be the borders. I'm gonna try to make this border be pretty uniform, so I'm going to do some marking to get a guideline for where that's going to go. The last step will be figuring out what to do with that red border. I've got a plan for this, but I'm going to need to see this before I decide what to do with that. So I'm going to take it down, do some marking, and then I'll show you the next step after that. I used a Crayola wash away marker to do my marking on that border, and I used a hoop to get my curves. I will now use those lines as the centers of feathers, the spine of the feather that's going to go around the edges. So that's all the marking I need to do. Just needed to get the spacing right. And I used the Crayola marker and the embroidery hoop to make my shapes with. So stitching next. Well, I think this thing is cursed. My camera tipped over. It's broken. So I've got a second camera in, and I don't know if it's going to do nearly as good a job. The other one landed right on the lens, and not looking real good, but we'll see what happens. I'm working around, taking the pins out as I go. After I get this done, then is when I'll go back and do this other line. And it's a lot of quilting. Actually, if I added up the square inches of quilt, there's actually more of the space in the two borders than there was in the entire inside of the quilt. One of the things that I like to think about when I'm doing a vintage or an antique quilt is how it would have been quilted at the time it was made. And one of the things that sort of makes that determination is contrary to what we have today, quilt battings were very much different than they are now. We read a package of quilt batting today, it'll give us the recommended maximum amount of space that you can have between the quilting. You know, some of them will say 4 or 5 inches, some of them will say as much as a foot apart, so that your quilting doesn't need to be that close together. But old quilts were much denser in their amount of quilting, and that was because the batting was different. If you look at some old antique quilts, they're often, if they're not quilted close together, there's often places where there's the quilt batting has sort of disintegrated and sort of wadded up into a ball in various spots because the quilting wasn't real close together to hold that batting from shifting around. So older quilts, generally speaking, had a lot more quilting than they do now. So if I want to make a quilt look rather authentic, I'm going to put in a lot more quilting because that's how they would have done it. They would have had to have a lot of quilting, and the quilting, in addition to being beautiful, it had a function, and that was to keep that batting from migrating and separating. So if I'm making a quilt that I want to look vintage or antique, that's one of the things that I consider, is that it needs to have a lot of quilting. The other thing that I don't think really fits well with a quilt that you're trying to get a vintage or antique look, I don't think that the overall swirly pantograph repeat pattern type quilting is the most appropriate choice. It's certainly not what they would have done 100 years ago. So if you're going for authenticity, try to think of what quilting pattern there would have been on it, and try something close to that. I know some of the overall patterns are a lot easier to do, but it may not be the most in keeping with the style of the quilt. Well, that brings me to the end of this one, and so the next go across is going to be the individual places between. I'm going to bring up my thread to the top, and that'll be a place where I come back to tie it off. I want to get that bobbin thread up to the top as well. It's easier if I have it on the top than if I have it buried. So I pull that up too, and then that leaves me two ends that I'll tie together and then use the needle to insert it into the quilt. So let's go back to the beginning here. Wow, that's a lot of quilt. So from here, I'm going to start out. I keep getting miles of extra thread that I don't need. Let's get rid of that. Bring up the thread. out of the way. Now, well, I'll show you in a minute when I get there. I don't know if you can see it, but you see now I'll have a bit of an oval space in the center. I may come back and do some filling in of that area. I'm going to have to look at it when the whole thing is done, but it might be kind of neat to fill that in. Maybe with a simple straight line. Okay, I ran out of bobbin, so I'm going to stop for now. The next time I will have finished all the border and probably done a simple treatment on that edge, and I can show you how it looks finished. But basically it's just a lot more of the same from there on. So happy quilting.